Welcome to this conference on Asia Visions and Voices, Geopolitical Consequences of U.S.-China Tensions. So we have the honor to have two speakers to give opening remarks. So let's welcome the president of National Tsinghua University, President Zhang Cao, first.
Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see familiar faces and making new friends at this opportunity. I'll keep my remarks short because I know everybody's eager to get to the meat of the today's event. As we know, the world is always changing. If you think back to COVID times, which wasn't too long ago, you understand that every issue has multiple dimensions. It has, for COVID, for example, it's more than just a public health medical issue. It's geopolitics, it's culture, it's economics, it's disruption of the supply chain, and on and on and on and on and on. So obviously, we took lessons from what we have learned in the past, which is multi-dimensional dialogue is absolutely paramount, absolutely paramount. And that was the genesis of an event that NTHU and the foundation and the Kennedy School had more than a year ago, this time last year, to look at semiconductors, not only from a technology angle, but from geopolitics and foreign relation, national security dimension as well. So I'm very happy that this is version 2.0 continuation of that conversation. And I hope that into the future, we can continue these kind of exchange because understanding different points of view from different countries, different governments, different sectors will allow us to work better as a group together. So thank you so much for waking up early and joining us on today's event. I look forward to a very exciting, stimulating exchange. Thank you.
Thank you, President Cao. And now we have our second speaker, the director of the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia and Daewoo Professor of International Affairs, Harvard Kennedy School, Professor Tony Saige.
Thank you. Of course, I want to thank, first of all, the Taipei School of Economics and Political Science for all their help in organizing this, and in particularly the foundation and Chairman Huang for his steadfast support of this and the other activities. As President Gao said, this is a follow-on from a conference that we had about a year ago, and we decided after that one it would be interesting to bring in a wider range of voices from Asia and to look at it in a broader framework of the geopolitical consequences and also looking at things like industrial policy and so forth. So I also want to thank all those who contributed pulling this together, but I think we should give a special vote of thanks to Hans, who really is the one who's pulled a lot of this together for us. So as I've already written before, the US-China tensions have created what I call a double dilemma for those nations within Asia, as those nations seek to navigate between the economic Asia, where, especially if one looks at trade, it's somewhat different with investment, we see a domination of China, and of course the security Asia, where the US maintains alliances that China really cannot currently hope to rival. I'll talk later, if there's time, about some of the factors which I think are driving this in terms of China's own policy. But I think there's a number of interesting questions for us to consider today. One being, how are nations striving to attain what I would call strategic autonomy within this increasing tension? Presentations, and I think from the titles that I've seen, we see suggestions that there's a continuum, in a way, across which different countries range. And I think that varies depending on the particular topic area, whether it's trade, whether it's investment, whether it's technology, or whether it's security. I think one can line the different nations up on that. I think a second question is what characteristics of a state may be most important in their ability to avoid being forced into a binary choice with this. Thirdly, I think, what are the nation's key strengths and weaknesses that will facilitate that country meeting their particular goals? And lastly, are the ways in which a country can benefit from the growing US-China competition and tensions? It doesn't seem to me it has to be negative. It seems to me there's gaps. It seems to me there's spaces that nations can exploit to their own interest. One last point I want to make, because I think this is a crucial area, and I think that's going to come with technology, including AI. China, as we know, is investing heavily in the technologies of the future and would like to use the BRI to lock in other nations to those technologies. I think that's the play that China is trying to make moving forward. And of course, we've seen the US counter with the October 2022 bans around semiconductors. And now, of course, we see moving through the political spectrum in Washington, the Biosecure Act, which is creating very different opinions within the US. So on this area, I think particularly technology and AI, I think it might be impossible to thread a particular way through. I think it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to run a US system, a Western system, and a Chinese system simultaneously. So I look forward to the discussions. I'm sure they're going to be interesting, and I wish you all the best for the conference.
So now we're about to launch our first panel. So please stay seated for a few minutes so our staff can set up the panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's start the first panel, U.S. and China tensions. This panel is chaired by Professor Wu Yusan, academia sinica, Professor of Political Science, National Taiwan University, Professor, TSE, National Tsinghua University. And we have 4 panelists and 3 discussants in this panel. So please, Professor Wu.
Thank you very much. And it is indeed my great honor to be able to moderate the first session of this wonderful conference. President Gao, Professor Sage, and ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to talk about the geopolitical consequences of U.S.-China tensions. In this session, we are going to have 4 wonderful papers. The first one will be presented by Professor Li Xinhua at the Department of Political Science and International Relations, Korea University, and she's going to talk about the strategic direction of Korea as influenced by U.S.-China tensions. The second speaker will be Professor Danny Guo, and he is Li Kai-shing Professor in Economics and the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at National University of Singapore. And he's going to talk about the U.S.-China tensions, third nation strategies to navigate shifting geopolitical and economic drivers. The third paper will be presented by Professor Tang Hei Wai, and he is the Victor and William Fong Professor in Economics, Director of Asia Global Institute, Director of APEC Study Center, and Associate Director of Hong Kong Institute of Economics and Business Strategy at the University of Hong Kong. And he's going to talk about new globalization trends and geopolitical and technological shocks. The fourth paper will be presented by my colleague, Professor Hans Tung, and he is Excelsior Chair Professor of Political Science and Associate Dean for Research and Development at the College of Social Sciences, National Taiwan University. And he is my colleague there, and he is also professor at the Taipei School of Economics and Political Science, National Tsinghua University, and there he is also my colleague. And he is going to talk about Taiwan's strategic ambiguity and clarity amid U.S.-China tensions. And I'm going to be the discussant for the first 2 papers, and then Professor Eve Tinbergen will discuss the next 2 papers. Professor Tinbergen is professor at the Department of Political Science, University of British Columbia. He is faculty associate at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, and he is also co-director at UBC for the Center for Japanese Studies. So let's start with Professor Li.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would like to extend my gratitude to invite me over to here to this very important conference, and Amitabh, Acharya, and the other colleagues. Since I'm the first speaker of the first session, although I was asked to talk about South Korea's perspectives, allow me talk about some 5 points of what is the changing geopolitical order in this area, and what is the strategic or policy orientations that South Korean governments have. Let me just give some kind of 5 points for what's my observation on what is going on around this region. The first is ongoing U.S.-China tension, of course. The U.S.-China tension, we know surged prominently in 2018 with the Trump administration's trade war that led to economic and technological, what we call decoupling, especially in high-tech industries. Under Xi Jinping, China expanded its global influence while the U.S. worked to contain its military ambition, particularly in the South China Sea and Taiwan. And Europe, and meanwhile, balanced economic ties with China and security alignment with the U.S. Actually, that's the situation what South Korea faces as well, by the way. So what began as a trade dispute has evolved into a broader strategic competition, not only in trade and economic area, but also political, economic, and even military issues, and later on for governance and ideology. And that was further intensified by the COVID-19 pandemic. So during those COVID-19, those tensions with China is not only remain at the state level, but at the level of the general publics, there are bit suspicions and also negative connotation arise against China. The second issue is impact of the war in Ukraine. Well, while particularly since 2018, the U.S.-China tension arise, and Europe and other countries like the Korea and Japan face some kind of dilemma, like a twist between the economy toward China and the politics toward the U.S. I think that changed significantly. The reason is because Russian invasion give us the more importance for value or like-minded countries consolidations. So that the Russian invasion has significantly reshaped U.S.-China relations and the global geopolitical order. The U.S. strengthened its military ties with Europe and the NATO, and by providing advanced weaponry such as HIMARS to Ukraine, reinforcing its military superiority. So we recognize the security alliance with the U.S. for the country's survival as well. So this conflict also intensified U.S. pressure on China regarding Taiwan, with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's 2022 visit provoking large-scale military drills from the Beijing in this area as well. In response to these tensions, the U.S. and its allies have pursued a so-called de-risking strategies, selectively reducing reliance on China in key sectors, particularly high-tech area, while maintaining some economic ties in general. So-called the small yard, high fence approach targets high-tech industries like semiconductors, leading to formation of the Chip 4 alliance between U.S., South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan to counter China's ambition in this field. Additionally, with challenges in the U.S. shipbuilding sector, including high labor cost and slow production, South Korean companies like Hyundai Heavy Industries are valued for their advanced capabilities in faster and more efficient shipbuilding. However, further collaboration may require change to U.S. laws that currently restrict the use of the foreign-built military ships. And in event of the possibility of Trump coming back, this is one of the important issues for South Korea to highlighting to the U.S. Opinion leaders. Those shipping cooperation with South Korea will be good for the interest of the U.S. as well as the interest of South Korea. So this evolving landscape reflects the growing strategic competition between U.S., China, Russia, with Europe and key partners like South Korea playing critical roles in shaping future geopolitical and economic alliances. Third area is the North Korea and Russia alliance and shifting security in East Asia. Until this month, I'm serving as ambassador of international cooperation on North Korean human rights. So although my mission is on North Korean human rights issues, I'm a kind of champion of highlighting for the North Korea's security threats, and on one hand, and the North Korean human rights issue on the other hand is a two sides of the same coins. So I try to build up some kind of academic and policy rationale for those issues. Having said that, I had an opportunity to talk about a negative implication of the North Korea and Russia's a tighter military alliance. So they just signed for the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement last June, and that marks a major shift concerns in East Asian security dynamics. So this pact provides mutual military support and has enabled North Korea to accelerate its nuclear and missile programs with Russian technology, heightening regional tensions. North Korea has not only capitalized on U.S.-China tensions, but is also manipulating or exploiting the broader Russia-West conflict to its own advantages. Emboldened by Russian support, not only bilaterally but at the UN platforms as well, North Korea has adopted a more aggressive military posture while simultaneously benefiting from Russia's veto power in the UN Security Council to undermine sanctions. This year was the first time in 15 years from their perspective, thanks to Russian veto, their sanction expert panel committee stopped their activities. Russia's support has also allowed the North Korea to enhance its control over its people with human rights abuses such as information suppression and public execution and political prisoners camp, to name a few, while solidifying its regime security on the international stage. Fourth point is the North Korea-Russia military alignment and what is China's position and strategic calculation. Of course, China didn't like it. Particularly, they didn't like their military alliance, so they tried to distance itself from that military possible aggression. However, China's reaction reflects a complex and cautious approaches. Beijing is visibly uneasy about growing closeness between Pyongyang and Moscow, as demonstrated by its decision not to send high-level delegations to North Korea's Victory Day celebrations. That was their the political victory, but they still didn't send them, despite the occasion making the 75th anniversary of the diplomatic relationship between North Korea and China. And also they removed the Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un's footprint plaque in Dailin, further illustrate China's discomfort with Pyongyang's strategic alignment with Moscow. But some argue that China sees potential strategic benefit from Pyongyang and Moscow's military bondage, particularly if North Korea escalates tension on the Korean Peninsula during a potential Chinese conflict over Taiwan, distracting U.S. military resources and weakening its capacity to defend Taiwan. Although the U.S. has some more than 20,000 the American forces in South Korea. However, still many believe, including myself, it is in Beijing's interest to limit the North Korea-Russia's alignment, including missile tests, to avoid further destabilizing in East Asia. Having said that, if China takes a military action against Taiwan, it would significantly impact the broader East Asia and Indo-Pacific region. A simultaneous conflict in Taiwan and the Korean Peninsula would pose a major challenge for the U.S., as managing two fronts in the same region would stretch its military capacity. While the U.S. typically manages conflict in separate regions, a dual conflict in East Asia could provide China with a strategic advantage by dispersing the U.S. resources. South Korea, heavily reliant on U.S. security guarantees, would face heightened challenges, particularly if North Korea seized the opportunity to escalate tensions. This would not only increase South Korea's security burden, but also strain its economic ties with China. Prolonged or intensified conflict in Taiwan and Korea would further complicate the U.S. ability to stabilize both fronts, potentially requiring greater contribution from allies that could escalate regional military tensions. I have to also mention about the role of ASEAN. ASEAN and other Indo-Pacific nations would likely seek to maintain a neutral stance, focusing on preventing the escalation of conflict, safeguarding economic and security stability. These countries would likely attempt to balance relations between the US and China using multilateral or unilateral frameworks to mitigate the risk of broader regional conflict. However, deepening US-China tension may force them to reevaluate their security strategies. Last point is President Putin's recent shift in nuclear doctrine, expanding the possibility of nuclear weapon use in response to conventional attack has raised global security concerns. This move set a dangerous precedent, particularly for authoritarian dictator regime like North Korea, which may use it to justify its aggressive nuclear stance. North Korea has already accelerated its nuclear and missile programs, and Putin's rhetoric could further embolden Kim Jong-un. In the US, North Korea denuclearization has taken a backseat to other global crises like Ukraine and the Gaza area, and some suggest future negotiation may shift toward arms control rather than full denuclearization. If Trump returns to office, he may pursue arms reduction talks with Kim Jong-un as a political trophy or political win, which could improve somewhat U.S. and North Korea relations, but potentially weaken the U.S.-South Korea alliance and compromise South Korea's security. I think they will cross our security red line. Additionally, North Korea might push for suspending U.S. ROK, the South Korea's military exercise, withdrawing U.S. strategic assets from the Korean Peninsula. That would increase South Korea's defense burden and destabilizing U.S. and South Korea's alliance. And those shifts in nuclear doctrine, particularly the mention of the tactical nuclear weapon, pose a serious security threat, highlighting the rise of nuclear escalation similar to the Cold War era deterrence. And also not only Korea, but Japan, we will think about our own nuclear development. And briefly, I will talking about the South Korea strategic direction. How we South Korea navigate those strategic direction amid U.S.-China rivalry. First, shifting inter-Korean relations. Under President Yoon, South Korea moved from a reactive stance toward North Korea to a more assertive strong versus strong approaches. This shift, marked by enhanced military drills and stronger deterrence, aims to counter Pyongyang's provocation more effectively and strengthen regional stability backed by deeper U.S. and Japan cooperation through mechanisms like the Nuclear Consultative Group, NCG. Second, strengthening U.S., South Korea, Japan's trilateral security cooperation. This trilateral alliance has become a cornerstone of South Korea's defense strategies, significantly boosting deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. President Yoon's effort to improve relations with Japan, despite historical tension and heavy domestic opposition and political risk domestically, have strengthened this cooperation as seen during 2023 Camp David Summit. But challenges remains in ensuring the continuity of this institutionalized security framework, particularly in the face of potential challenge in U.S. leadership or a potential change of the South Korean leadership. The third is a balancing economic and security interest. South Korea faced the challenges of a balancing in its economic reliance on China with its security dependence on the U.S. While China is its largest trading partner, especially in semiconductors, the U.S. remained vital for defense, as I mentioned earlier. South Korea is diversifying supply chain and investing in technology to reduce economic dependence on China while maintaining security alliance with the United States. The fourth, lattice work, security architecture, and multilateral and minilateral cooperation. The U.S. Indo-Pacific strategies emphasize a so-called lattice work security architecture through alliances like a Quad, AUKUS, to name a few. South Korea is encouraged to shift from a protective to a more proactive alliance role, contributing to regional security while aligning with the democratic allies to counter China's influence. The fifth is the navigating trilateral cooperation with China and Japan. While we emphasize like-minded alliance, particular alliance with the U.S., the resumption of the South Korea-China-Japan Trilateral Summit in 2024, first time in 4.5 years, it reflects South Korea's necessity to balance its security commitments with the U.S. and economic and other ties to China. By focusing on practical cooperation on issues like climate change and digital transformation, South Korea seeks to navigate great power rivalry while maintaining regional stability. The sixth is expanding role in global governance. South Korea's global influence is growing, and discussion about its inclusion at G7 are intensifying. Despite Japan's opposition, South Korea's participation would enhance the G7 ability to address global issues like economic security and climate change. And South Korea also remains active in multilateral institutions like the UN, we are the now non-permanent Security Council's member, and contributing to international governance and peacekeeping. And myself, as a person who's been working for the UN for a long while, and also in multilateral security issues, after I just finished my ambassadorship, I'm now helping South Korean governments to do something with the possible inclusion with the G7 plus architectures. Last but not least, South Korea's strategic direction and so-called hybrid multilateralism. South Korea's evolving foreign policy embraces hybrid multilateralism, what I call, which combines strong alliance with a like-minded nation on one hand, while I believe we have to actively engage with what I call swing state or middle ground state or unlike-minded countries. This approach allows South Korea and like-minded countries to pragmatically pursue our own national interest by finding common ground and areas for even with a state that do not share its value. I think there we have to think about how we can more engage with China is important. By strengthening its role in global supply chain and the digital economy and climate change initiatives, South Korea and like-minded countries aim to protect its economic and security interests while expanding diplomatic influence. This strategy is crucial for maintaining flexibility amidst the US-China competition and advancing the national goals. Finally, the President Yoon and the Yoon government advocate for South Korea's foreign policy under the banner of Global Pivotal State, GPS. However, domestic political conflict, we are very much politically divisive now, and often fail to stop at the water's edge, significantly influencing foreign policy and international relations. Additionally, the North Korea's risk, marked by military aggression and they are heavily armed with even nuclear issues, the weapons, economic hardship, food shortages, and ambition for a fourth-generation hereditary dictatorship present a persistent threat of contingencies. These two factors pose substantial challenge for South Korea as it navigates the rapidly changing global landscape and regional dynamics, complicating our efforts to present a coherent strategic direction. So I think we need our like-minded countries' help and support. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Second paper will be presented by Professor Kwok.
Thank you, Chair. I hope we can put up my, okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair, for starting us out so well on the discussion. And thank you, Prof. Lee, for laying the stage against the broader canvas, as well as your describing to us what South Korea's options and actions will be. I want to build on what Professor Lee has said, obviously not to say again what South Korea will do, because I don't know, nor do I want necessarily to focus on any specific other nation to say what they will do, but I want to maybe take a slightly more conceptual attack on the problem of what nations, all the rest of us, need to be thinking about as US-China or geopolitical rivalry more generally continues to intensify. What is it that third nations ought to be thinking about, and what can we do? So there are three themes in what I want to say about third nations. And you'll notice the first theme is, I say third nations. I don't name a nation. I don't name South Korea, nor do I name Singapore or the United Kingdom. For me, I want to be talking to you about what other nations other than the two great powers in the most intense competition, ought to be thinking about they can do. What are these third nations? And by third nations, I stay away also from trying to think about a divide between what small states can do, what middle powers can do, what those states that are between middle powers and great powers can do. I'm not interested in that division. I'm interested in the 80% of humanity who lives outside of the most intense of great power rivalry. Because after all, 80% of humanity lives outside the United States and China. And my second theme is I want to think about third nations as being more than just passive recipients of externally given policies, foreign policies. I want to think about third nations as actually having agency to affect the global outcome. So I don't think about this is where the great powers are contending. We, the rest of us, need to simply observe silently with great respect, and then whatever emerges out of that, we'll do the best we can. In other words, I want to go beyond what many of us think of as the Neo-Thucydides realism, that the great powers do what they will, the rest of us suffer what we must. I want to go beyond thinking that the best that we, the third nations, might do is take a poisoned shrimp strategy. We are small, we protect ourselves by making it so that anybody who tries to swallow us will find it painful, but we don't imagine ourselves affecting what the big boys can do. I want to do that. I want us to think about how third nations can indeed affect what the big boys can do. So for the economists in the audience, there's a language that's helpful here. I want us to think about third nations as being more than just price takers. Even if we were literally just price takers, from economics, we know that consumers being price takers does not mean that the supply curve for the market is horizontal. Consumers can be price takers and can still affect outcomes. How do we exercise this agency? How do we get beyond this Thucydides realist fatalism? So my point is to try and give some ideas about how we do that in a way that's sufficiently general that any third nation can plug in here. So here are 3 ways in which I think third nations can exercise agency in the face of great power competition that goes beyond our simply trying to be a poisoned shrimp or accepting what the great powers give to us. A first that I want to expand on is something called inadvertent cooperation. I want to develop for you in the couple of minutes the idea that yes, we should be trying to get great powers to cooperate with one another, but the mere fact that great powers might say, for ideological reasons, strategic reasons, political reasons, playing to the home crowd audience kind of reasons, we won't cooperate, that does not remove the possibility for cooperation. Cooperation can be inadvertent. And I'm going to suggest that, yes, we do want to try and induce cooperation, but that doesn't mean getting people to sign a treaty. It means aligning incentives. How can we as third nations help great powers see an alignment of incentive? A second thing I want to suggest we can do is to recognize how a lot of great power rivalry results in gridlock. And it results in gridlock that if each great nation could tell the other, come along with me, they could emerge from that gridlock in a sensible way. We're trying to solve the global climate crisis. We happen to have fallen into a situation, an equilibrium, where the best response to what my nation is doing is for the other nation also to practice protectionism. And in both of us practicing protectionism, we remove the possibility that the world gets to have more renewables technology. We are in what game theorists and economists would call a prisoner's dilemma situation, or a phrase that I've been trying to use in some of my own writing, we're in an epic fail equilibrium. Third nations can come along and help nudge the great powers out of gridlock. And to be very careful, I want us to have a visualization. If 2 great powers are coming towards each other as ocean liners, it is not for us or anyone else to get between them. That's a sure fail strategy. However, there are ways in which we can exercise leaning in to get these 2 ocean liners to come away from their sure collision, from their prisoner dilemma outcome. So I want to say a few words about how we can nudge great powers out of gridlock. And then the third way in which I think third nations can exercise agency is to practice what in Singapore we call pathfinder multilateralism. Okay? If multilateralism is the first best outcome we can hope for, it's a level playing field, everybody respects the rules, there are clear rules that benefit everyone, we happen to have developed a security structure so that everyone does obey the rules, everyone is protected, we have commitment to peaceful dispute of resolution, that's the multilateralism that we all want. That has been available to us for a lot of the last 7 decades. However, the way geopolitical rivalry is going, significant chunks of that multilateral landscape are being torn away. Whether it's from small things like blocking of the dispute resolution body at World Trade Organization, the putting in place unilateral tariffs and sanctions, parts of that are being pulled away. What can third nations who are not in the thick of one great power trying to inflict harm on another great power, what can we do to build other kinds of multilateralism? That's what pathfinder multilateralism is. So I've shot my shots already, as it were. I've given you my conclusions. My conclusion is that there are clear ways, at least these 3, by which third nations, small nations, middle powers, however you want to think of them, but the 80% of humanity, can try and make the world a better place. And we do that not by curling ourselves up into a poisoned shrimp ball, but actually going out there and trying to affect global outcomes. Now, the rest of the time that I've got, I know I only have 5 minutes left here, but I'm going to give you a flavor of how this reasoning goes. Those who are interested, there's a fresh paper in preparation. There are other papers I've written that develop these themes. But if I may, just the 5 minutes I've got left, I will show you some of what's going on here. Okay, so there's actually a graph here which I haven't said anything about. And this is a graph that tries to give a little bit of empirical evidence that says I'm not just shooting in the wind on this. I'm not just sort of being, so hopeful, starry-eyed, thinking that third nations can actually go out there and actually change things. I just want to give a little piece of affiliated evidence. Suppose we ask ourselves, look around the world, what are the nations that have been more successful? I don't mean more successful in the battlefield, because the most successful in the battlefield, you've got boots on the ground, you've got nuclear weapons, you've got ICBMs. That is a linear, totally straightforward way to think about success. My goal is not for third nations to get in the middle of that, but other ways in which we can measure success. One way we can measure success is per capita GDP. How well have you been able to provide for your own people? Right. Well, if you look at nations ranked by per capita GDP, among the first 9, the United States stands out clearly. 350 million people, big nation, great power, successful economically. Here's the surprise. Of the other 8 nations that are as successful or more successful than the United States, they're small and they're smaller than Singapore. Singapore loves to talk about the creation myth of how it went from third world to first world. It's only got 3.5 million people. What an amazing achievement that was. Today it's got a population of about 6 million people. The average population of the world's 8 richest, most successful countries, not counting the United States, is only 4 million. Most of the world that's successful is small, and we have figured out ways to do this. So my writing, my work is how these small nations have been able to be successful. So here, just to spend the remaining 3 minutes I've got on the reasoning that goes into this. I said, look for inadvertent cooperation. Most of us, when we hear cooperation, we look around and we say, can we get ideologies to line up? Can we get countries to sign treaties? Can we meet in San Francisco and not sort of be at loggerheads with each other? How do we fine-tune the small yards, high fences language? I said, that's not the right way to approach cooperation. The right way to approach cooperation is to remember how we get dinner on our tables. It is not, as Adam Smith said, it is not from the benevolence or the goodwill or the cooperative spirit of the butcher, baker, or brewer that we get food on our tables. It's from their regard to their self-interest. It's from people paying attention to their self-interest that we get cooperation and good outcomes. So one of the ways in which we should be thinking about this is how can we look at examples like renewables that are now being clouded over with sanctions on electric vehicles and electric batteries and tariffs. There's a clear win-win outcome here, which is that the world needs more renewables energy. And instead, we've spent our time fighting over who does not get to produce that renewable energy. Well, what we should be doing is naming and shaming. We should make those countries, the big countries that are applying this line of sanctions, feel extremely awkward and uncomfortable about how they are damaging the global environment. If one country puts subsidies on electric vehicles, you too should be putting subsidies on your electric vehicles. There's a win-win outcome from doing this. You try to beat out the other guy, and in doing this, you've created more renewables technology that the global South can use. Inadvertent cooperation. I have, there's the idea of prisoner's dilemma is well known to political scientists as well as economists. We know that that's what's going out there in great power rivalry is indeed an example of a prisoner's dilemma outcome out of which no great power can extricate itself. Well, I and others are writing about how in a writing theoretically, analytically, but how in a prisoner's dilemma type situation, external agents can nudge great powers. By nudge, I mean in a behavioral economic sense. By applying a small amount of pressure, you can exercise a big movement from great powers being pushed away from gridlock. And so there are examples of how we need to be doing that. And let me conclude. Multilateralism, when it's available, works wonderfully. It's worked so wonderfully that the world went from unipolarity centered on the United States to multipolarity, where everyone now is part of the global narrative. That has been a problem because that has removed the incentive for the United States to continue to play benevolent hegemon. But the way in which these incentives work, if we can't move the great powers away from gridlock, let's build our own restricted circles of multilateralism. Whether it's a version of regionalism, as my colleague Selina Ho and others have tried to develop, or whether it's a version of plurilateralism, which in real-world practice, the WTO is already practicing, we can build ways in which restricted multilateralism can work for smaller groups than everyone else, but can also be open and inclusive. It's not unfriendly to non-unanimity, that allows, if ever the United States wanted to come back in, we would welcome the United States. So that concludes my talk. The paper itself explains why we have, provides a narrative about why we have come into the situation that we have. Let me just say 2 words about that. For the longest time, we thought that geopolitics would lead to a world that was fragmented because America and China, different political systems could not agree with each other. But economics would hold the world together. Economics would provide a force for coalescence. And for the first half of the last 70 years, indeed, it did that. But from 2010 on, with China's rise and what emerged to be what America calls, what the world calls, the China shock, that trade with China was no longer win-win, but that trade with China was stealing our jobs, dismantling our industries, turning into ghost towns, what used to be thriving middle-class communities. Economics, trade no longer holds the world together. So both forces are now driving for fragmentation. That's why we need our friends, third nations, to step back in and play a more active role in determining world order. That's my story. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. The third paper will be presented by Professor Tang.
Thank you, Professor Wu, Thank you so much for having me here, especially to Hans and TJ. It has been a wonderful presentation already. It's very hard to talk right after Danny Quah because he's dynamic, energetic, and always thought-provoking. So what I decided to do, knowing that I'm going to speak after him, is to show you some figures and graphs, and just to tell you a little bit about what's going on in globalization and in a global economy. I'm not going to provide recommendations or suggestions for any countries. I'm just here to show you the facts, and then you make up your mind about what needs to be done for Taiwan, for any other places on Earth. All right, let me start. So first, this is not the first time that we went through some sort of slow globalization, or you may want to say, in a more negative way, deglobalization. If you use the traditional measure of trade openness, which is import plus export divided by global GDP, that ratio has been declining since 2010. Last time when it was declining, it was actually between the First and the Second World War. I'm not suggesting that we're going back to that era, but I want to highlight the differences between what had happened since the 1980s up to 2008 and what had happened after 2008. If you focus on just sort of the traditional measures of trade openness, it is true that the world is trading less with each other as compared to the size of the economy. During COVID, like many of you, I was stuck at home having nothing to do but reading history books. So I read a dozen of history books about globalization. I also read a lot of papers on international trade, as I have done in the last 20 years. So I decided to summarize all my readings of history, literature, as well as economics research. I realized that for a world to went through multiple years of peaceful and sustainable globalization, we need to have three necessary conditions. What I mean is that you cannot miss any of them. You have to have all three of them at the same time in order to expect that the world will be able to go back to what we have experienced in the 80s and 90s. So the first one is that the leading technology in the world at the moment has to be market integrating. Let me give you an example, right? During the first globalization from 1870 to 1911, that kind of globalization was essentially facilitated by the steam engine, which has increased efficiency in transportation as well as mass production. In the second wave of globalization that started in the 70s, it was mostly because of the ICT technology. First is cheaper and more efficient long-distance telephone calls, and later on is obviously the internet, and now all the free streaming and online discussions. But if you talk about the technology that we have today, obviously everyone has in mind AI, blockchains, big data, cloud computing. I'm not sure whether those kind of technologies are bringing markets closer to each other or actually decentralizing some of the production that we have seen happening in a single location. So that's my first point. The second necessary condition for us to have peaceful and sustainable globalization is that the leading power at the moment, at the time, has to derive enough political and economic interest to promote multilateralism and multilateral organization. Obviously, I was talking about the United Kingdom in the 19th century and the United States since the Second World War up to the most recent years. The third necessary condition is that globalization is supposed to create more winners than losers, especially within countries that there are more people getting benefit from globalization. Here, I'm talking about maybe China in the last 3 decades up to recently, certainly not the United States in the last 2 decades, when we started seeing increasing inequality, partly due to globalization, but mostly, in my opinion, due to technological disruption. So because we don't seem to have any of the three necessary conditions today, I'm not too optimistic that we are going to go back to what we have seen in the 80s and 90s. But I would like to remind you that globalization will never die. It is not dying. It is just changing. It has become more regionalized, as Professor Quah has mentioned. It has also become more digitized with more digital trade, more service trade that is facilitated by digital technologies. It is also becoming more fragmented. So I'm going to talk about new globalization in a few minutes, but let me remind you the good old days when we have Premier Zhu Rongji in China talking to President Bill Clinton in the United States. There are thinking that through market integration, through trade liberalization, mainland China will become more like the United States, to become more liberal, more democratized. Well, I don't think they were, dreaming about it, because they were living and working in the era when everyone is talking about neoliberalism. Many political scientists here have read great work by Francis Fukuyama. The end of history predicted that modernization theory would determine the destiny of a country. The country would become more democratic because if not, they would suffer from the so-called middle income trap. Recently I started thinking, when the entire world appears to be moving towards the left-hand side of the political and economic spectrum, was the 80s and 90s exceptional, or are we living in a world that is exceptional? Are we spending too much time during the neoliberal era, hoping that the future will be the same, with more liberal order, with more westernized democratic order around the world, or that the world has decided to move on in two different directions? One, continue to support this kind of neoliberal economic or political order. The other side of the world deciding to engage in more industrial policy and also more protectionist policies. I'm not so sure. It's a big question mark to me. But after reading history for so many years, I realized that the last 30 years before 2008 appears to be more exceptional than I thought. So this is very thought-provoking. Actually, last night I had a conversation with Danny Quah. Modern international trade research actually started by Balazs, Samuelson, and there is a famous paper. Danny and I went to MIT. It's written by Dornbusch, Fisher, and Samuelson. All these wonderful foundational papers for modern international trade research were introduced in the 70s when the new liberal order started. And then I was joking with Danny, saying that we should actually spend more time reading economic historian research, especially by our famous professor Charles Kindleberger at MIT. So maybe we have been studying the wrong international trade, while the right international trade is always talking about the world that we are living in right now. Anyhow, I try to compete with Danny about thought provocation. So let me go back to the data that I'm more familiar with. Again, this is a zoom-in picture of the one that I show you. Since 2008, the ratio between trade and GDP has been declining. And there are many, many reasons. I don't want to blame political forces as the main driver. There are technological reasons, like the use of labor-displacing technologies. There are also macroeconomic reasons, like population aging. Old people like to spend more money on services rather than on merchandise products. There's also a reason that China becomes so big that there have been a lot of production happening within mainland China rather than in the rest of the world. When there's more trade within China, it also means that there's less trade between China and the rest of the world, and there's actually less room for other countries, like third nations that Danny described, to trade with each other. So now we are talking about the reallocation of international trade, with supply chains now being split up, with China plus one, China plus N. Trade actually has become more inclusive, in my opinion. It has become more diverse, with many countries, especially those from Southeast Asia and in Latin America, enjoying some of the spun-off supply chains from mainland China. So from the 80s all the way to 2008, I would say China became an economic hegemon with more and more trade happening within China. And now the process is being reverted due to geopolitical shocks and also due to policy uncertainty within China. So I'm going to move on and talk about this familiar graph describing the US-China trade war. Average tariffs imposed by the US and China on each other is above 19%. If we have Donald Trump becoming the next president in the US, I think tariff rates will continue to increase. What is the implication for global trade? First of all, the US is no longer the top trade partner with mainland China. It is number 3, accounting for 14% of total Chinese exports. Used to be number 1, close to 19% in 2018. But I want to remind you that this is only describing direct export from China to the US and to other countries. So recently I started looking at something that is embedded in trade from other countries to the United States. And in international trade, we call this domestic value added. So thanks to the Asian Development Bank, there were global input-output tables up to the end of 2022. I was able to actually decompose international trade between countries and try to ask the following question. How much of the export from Vietnam, from Mexico, from Malaysia to the US actually had a root originating from China? It could be because of components exported from China to those places. It could also be because of foreign direct investment from Chinese investors to those places. So the answer is that China's domestic value-added export to the US continue to increase. It never slowed down. And the major reason is because of this thing, which is called, I would like to call it rerouted trade, or you can think of it as indirect trade through third nations. So the fraction of third-party trade in China's value-added trade to the US has been increasing. It currently accounted for over a quarter of total China's trade to the US. And the US remain to be the most important destination of Chinese products and exported goods. What are the third parties or third nations that appear to enjoy this kind of rerouting or reallocation of trade processes? Number one is Mexico. Number two is Vietnam. Number three is Taiwan. And then you have Canada, Korea, etc. On the vertical axis is actually estimated US billion dollars, okay? So as a result, if you look at trade from Mexico to the US, I would say over 10% of it is due to rerouted trade from China through Mexico to the US. Along with that process, there has been increased and reallocated foreign direct investment from China and the US in these third nations. The major beneficiaries have been ASEAN economies, in particular Malaysia. But if you look at FDI from China to a single country per capita, Singapore is the major winner. Danny can tell you about how much new money coming in from mainland China and how many new billionaires from mainland China are now living in Singapore. So this is for the US, this is for the world, this is for China. Basically there's no difference, right? Both largest two economies in the world are looking at ASEAN and other third nations for new market as well as new production platforms. On the geopolitical side, what is the implication, right? So the US-China trade war, in my opinion, has not created enough economic benefit for the US. On the contrary, it may have created unintended negative consequence on the geopolitical scene. And that is now ASEAN, Asian economies have become more connected with the Chinese economy through FDI and through trade rerouting. So, if the goal of the US is to have, Indo-Pacific economic partnership to make friends in Asia and to isolate China from its Asian partners, the trade war appears to do the opposite. It has actually pushed all the Asian economies towards China, and the Chinese companies have been going out with their foreign capital, with their ideas and technologies to create new production networks in the region. So finally, I want to say a few things about the new globalization, call it friendshoring or China plus one or China plus N. It has been happening. It actually makes supply chains less resilient because more supply chains become more specialized in importing from a single source. In Asia, it would be China. In North America, it would be from Mexico. So famous economist Beata Jovasic from Oxford University has done a wonderful study looking at the macroeconomic cost of complete friendshoring. Imagine a world that China only trades with its own partners and alliance economies. The US is not trading with China and only buying things from Mexico, Canada, and other places. Russia is only buying things from China, etc., and etc. What will happen to the world? The macroeconomic loss, surprisingly, is not that big. It's around 2% decline in steady state global GDP. But some economies like Singapore or Morocco are going to lose up to 5% of the GDP. And obviously, third parties are not benefiting from this kind of friendshoring trends. Let me remind you that globalization has become more regionalized, more service-oriented, and more digitized. The new trends in globalization would be about these three. So for small economies like Taiwan, Singapore, and other nations, they should focus on how to engage in this kind of new regional trade agreements, like RCEP or CPTPP. They should also realize that there are new macroeconomic drivers coming out from these new free trade agreements, like RCEP, or hopefully the renewed USMCA. And by the way, let me remind you that if Trump does become the new president of the United States, then he has a big decision to make in 2026, which is whether to renew USMCA. In other words, whether they will allow Mexico to enjoy low tariffs in the FTA. Service trade has been rising faster than merchandise products trade, right? So, for economies like Taiwan, they should really think about not just semiconductors, but maybe also service export as well. Finally, let me remind you very quickly, industrial policy is back, especially in rich countries. These two charts are from wonderful work done by Danny Roderick at Harvard Kennedy School and co-authors. You realize that the number of industrial policy intervention has been rising in the last 10 years, and most of it is actually coming from the top 20% of the richest economies, okay? So they're the US, Japan, Korea, etc. And the reasons for industrial policies are not so much about promoting economic growth. They are very diverse, right? Some of them are based on strategic competition, some of them are based on climate mitigation, some of them obviously are based on national security. So let me conclude by saying that we live in a world with slow globalization. Many big countries' governments are talking about security, inclusiveness, rather than economic efficiency. So therefore, in the next 5 or 10 years, we should expect lower economic growth rates as compared to the past 20 years. Trade becomes more regionalized and more fragmented. US-China trade war had created winners and losers outside of the two big economic powers. Taiwan obviously has benefited quite a bit from the tension between the two powers. Southeast Asian countries as well. So I think if the two powers continue to fight for another 10 or 20 years, they are helping other countries to emerge, and therefore I think that we are actually in a transition to a multimodal world. I don't know which country will be the next third emerging power, but if you ask me, I'm looking at 3 countries. 2 start with I, India and Indonesia. 1 start with M, which is Malaysia. And Taiwan really have to hedge very well with the rising geopolitical tension between China and the US. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The 4th speaker will be Professor Tong.
Thank you, Chair. And I do appreciate this chance to speak here in this conference where we can actually unshackle ourselves from some scientific rigor and explore policy implications with so many experts in this room. But on that note, I feel a bit ashamed to speak along with Danny because he was trying to offer solutions and not just identifying issues. But my message would probably be just more sounds like alarmist. And so next time if I have a chance to speak with Danny, then in the same occasion, I'll probably try to offer more solutions as well. All right, so here I'd like to talk about strategic ambiguity. And for quite a while, I think we all understand pretty well, especially in front of so many experts here, that the United States has adopted strategic ambiguity to the issues of cross-trade relationship for the purpose of having dual deterrence, deterring China from invading Taiwan and also deterring Taiwan from pursuing independence. So we don't, of course, have to explore any further on that because people here know this very well. And regarding the Taiwan issue, of course, China has been also strategically very clear about the end game all along. So probably there isn't much to be talked about. But how about Taiwan? So that's why I said I appreciate this chance because this gives me a chance to think this issue through. So it seems that there is some kind of interesting evolution of strategic ambiguities or clarity since the Ma Ying-jeou administration, which was between 2008 and 2016. And, sorry, I forget to. And also in today's talk, I would also like to explore potential effects of strategic ambiguity or clarity on Taiwan's resilience based on my recent survey experiments. And especially this is also, of course, very relevant to a current project I'm doing with my colleague, Reynard Sexton from Emory, who is now sitting among the audience. So during the Ma Ying-jeou era, let me move quickly because we don't have too much time. So it seems that President Ma, of course, when he won the election, he carried a pretty strong mandate with a stable majority in the Congress as well. So he won 7.6 million votes, and it's about 45% of the total votes. And his policy, briefly speaking, is the 3 no's. So no unification with the PRC in the short term, and no declaration of independence, and then no use of force. And during that time, of course, it's like a password, between the, across the Taiwan Strait, the 92 consensus. So it's basically, especially here in Taiwan, it's about one China, but 2 different interpretations. So that's where you can get this ambiguous component here, right? Because even though you do have such a one China framework, but here in Taiwan, it is a Republic of China, while it is People's Republic of China on the mainland. And also, he tries to deliver this diplomatic truce, or what he calls a viable diplomacy. In other words, there was no more competition with mainland China on pursuing more diplomatic allies for Taiwan. So you have some kind of truce across the Taiwan Strait. And then also he emphasized economic first and politics second. And so, of course, there's a reason for why. Of course, it seems to be, working across the Taiwan Strait because for Beijing, especially, at least under Hu Jintao era, so they got something from the 92 consensus, right? They got one China, even though they don't like the 2 interpretations. That's why, it's hardly mentioned or even never mentioned on the mainland, even under Hu Jintao era. And now, of course, under the Xi Jinping era, of course, it totally disappears. So under that Ma Ying-jeou administration, you could say that it's a strategic ambiguity in the sense that, well, he never said anything specific about whether we should reunify with China, or, of course, he didn't say anything about pursuing independence. So there's something in between. And of course, people might interpret that as strategic ambiguity tilting towards unification, but at least there's some ambiguity there. And during that time, of course, the US-China competition wasn't that fierce as it is today. So it was pretty much very mild back then. So that's kind of a very kind of brief snapshot of what happened under Ma Ying-jeou administration. And then during the Tsai administration between 2016 and 2024, then President Tsai also, of course, carried a pretty strong mandate, with also a stable, comfortable majority in the Congress when their term kicked off, right? So she won about 6.9 million votes and accounting for 56% roughly, a little bit even more than President Ma's. But the thing is, of course, because it's DPP, and they obviously don't like this idea too much about 92 consensus. So, but when she was just sworn in, she rejected the 92 consensus, yet kind of trying to be moderate by suggesting the 92 spirit at the beginning of her term. So to be more specific, during her 8 years, of course, this concept of 92 consensus was on hold. It didn't get talked about much. And then also they tried to keep or maintain Taiwan's de facto autonomy, and she adopted quite a few interesting policies to pursue that goal, such as new southbound policy. There's also a national security law here as well, and also military reforms, and which is actually something I'm working with right now. But nonetheless, she remained pretty reserved in tone. So she wasn't that hawkish as it sounded. But at the same time, the variables, you have other variables. For example, in China, Xi Jinping obviously had also become much tougher you know, especially after finishing his power consolidation. You know, I have another paper with Victor on the POA, and that's just gives you a pretty clear picture. You know, after Xi Jinping consolidated his power, then you know a lot of policies have become much more tougher, and he become more hawkish in many ways. But in general, I think compared to Ma Ying-jeou, even though it's a very different kind of strategic ambiguity, but you still have some flavor of that. So maybe you want to interpret that as strategic ambiguity tilting towards independence. But nonetheless, she wasn't, of course, very straightforward in terms of the end game of this cross relationship. She still tries to keep some kind of ambiguity and space for maneuvering. But at the same time, the U.S.-China competition also started to heat up during that 8 years. And for example, at the very beginning, Trump, you know, took the phone and have a conversation with her, and then of course afterwards you have trade war. So the thing is, of course, the cross relationship under the Taiwan administration was still kind of bumpy, but at least it wasn't as bumpy as it might be in the future. So that's what I'm actually going to focus on in my following presentation. So in general, I mean, to summarize a little bit, so basically, according to my view, we think that either under Ma Ying-jeou or Tsai Ing-wen, there was still some degree of ambiguity. I'm not saying anything about it's wrong or right. So that's not my, I'm not passing any judgment on that, but I'm just trying to present some objective picture. So how about Lai era, you know, which just began earlier this year. So for President Lai, well, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So basically, first of all, so President Lai, of course, carries a much weaker mandate. He won about like 5.6 million votes, accounting for only 40%. So it's obviously a little bit, you know, less than half of the people who went to the voting booth voted for him. And also his party doesn't have a majority in the Congress. So obviously now in Taiwan, we again have this divided government. But nonetheless, it seems that President Lai has a pretty different vision about how to deal with this issue. And this is what I want to, you know, focus on for the remaining parts. So almost 5 months into his first term, so now Lai has gradually deviated, I would say gradually deviated from Tsai's version of strategic ambiguity, if, you know, not entirely got rid of that. And second, of course, rejected 92 consensus outright and not trying to flirt with the idea, not like Tsai. I mean, even though Tsai didn't want to accept it, but still try to flirt with the idea with kind of 92 spirit. And also emphasize more strongly on the statehood for ROC. And, you know, we saw that from yesterday's speech. It could be ROC, it could be ROC Taiwan, or just Taiwan. I mean, he doesn't care about that distinction as he sings. So he emphasized a lot on that statehood for ROC as a distinct entity from PRC. So that's also a very clear message. It seems to be pretty consistent. I was also giving a talk at Cambridge in May, just right after the election. And it seems that the things I observed, you know, back then don't change much today. But he's obviously a very consistent man. And he also, and then also, of course, has decided to adopt this whole of society approach to national security. And this is, well, in a sense, somewhat continuous, because Tsai Ing-wen already started that reform, extending the conscription years, and also a lot of reforms, you know, in the service. So that's, and Lai Ching-te obviously wanted to extend that further. And then now we have this, you know, 3 committees, and one of them is this whole of a society national kind of civil defense committee. So it seems that strategically, President Lai is trying to be much clearer. And I want to ask this question, then what are the implications? So if you agree with me in terms of how I characterized these 3 different presidents in terms of their attitudes towards ambiguity and their policies, what might be the implications, especially when it comes to Taiwanese politics or society in general? So this is what I did a while ago, and I presented this at APSA just last month. So about this 2024 election and Taiwan's political polarization, So the background here is also run quickly given the time limit. So it's an empirical study and tries to tap into Taiwan's presidential election in 2024. And then, of course, also a brief background. I guess everyone here in this room knows that, well, the China factor is important in Taiwanese political landscape. You have Green Party, DPP versus blue or white. And then, you know, another thing is when it comes to the cross relationship, I know it's a simplification, but I tend to characterize them as a distinction between realists versus liberal, because it seems that well, I mean, again, there's no judgment about which one is right, but at least from what I have observed, so the Green Camp people, they believe that, well, we should, of course, you know, strengthen our national defense, and so that's a more realistic thinking, and it doesn't help much if you want to talk to China or have, you know, trade or investments in China. That's the idea for liberals, right? For you know, especially the IR theory, for liberals, the recipe for peace would be having, you know, trade, investments, and commercial exchanges, you know, make people have a second thought when they want to fight each other, right? But that's not idea for realists. For realists, you have to do some kind of balancing. So for Taiwan, you know, hard balancing and soft balancing are both important. And so it seems that for the Green Camp, they are the realists. They believe that the way to go is to, of course, get closer to the United States and get more weapons, and also with other democratic allies. But for the KMT and a little bit, I think, white, the Taiwan People's Party, they think that, well, we also should talk to China and, of course, create some kind of space or even ambiguity among, you know, between us, and then having more exchanges in a society, either it's economic or social, to create, you know, like the friendly environment, you know, and across the Taiwan Strait. That's the way to go. So you have these two very distinct ideas in these two different camps. You know, the thing is, what is funny here is that, I mean, they have the same goal, basically. They all want peace, but just they have very different visions about how to do that, or, you know, the ways through which you can accomplish peace. So for this research, I'm trying to explore this distinction or political polarization in Taiwan, and also try to see how the electoral defeat as an existential threat or crisis, and how does that contribute to Taiwanese people's, you know, voters' time horizon, and of course, not just time horizon, but also affect their preferences for policies. Okay, so yeah, so very quickly, of course, this is not APSA. So the thing is, you know, I have a couple, basically two hypotheses, right? So in terms of measuring time horizon, I use people's assessments of Taiwan's economic prospects and also the time horizon for China's military actions. So that's two very obvious ways to measure time horizon, obviously. And then for the policies, so this is, okay, so a very simple way to present the results to you without going through technicalities, right? So basically, you know, this is how we can tell the differences between the two camps. So let me just highlight some important news here. So basically, for those who would like to vote for the opposition candidates, you know, in this context would be KMT or white candidates coincide, right? So those who believe 92 consensus will be effective, they tend to, you know, they tended to vote for, or want to vote for the opposition, and also who believe the rise of China and China is going to be a number one in the world or in the region, they also, you know, would like to vote for the opposition party. And also the people who are pro-independence, they don't want to do that. So that's kind of very obvious. So, but what is interesting here is in terms of the military policies, so those who are very pessimistic about Taiwan, they also tend to vote for, wanted to vote for the opposition party. And also those who believe the service trade should be kicked off, renegotiated, also are the people who want to vote for KMT or white candidates. And also those who are against the conscription reform, they wanted to vote for the opposition party. So it seems that there's a very clear kind of sorting going on in Taiwanese electoral landscape in 2094. Okay, so to do that, then I have a couple of different measurements. We'll basically try to, you know, measure the differences in their responses to these different policies. And yeah, I'll share the paper later. But basically, it's about the will to fight It's about their skepticism towards the U.S. support. It's about their exit option, whether they want to emigrate or not, or whether they agree with the conscription reform, and also whether they. Okay, there's another case where people are arguing we should make Taiwan a not a presidential system, but a parliamentary system in order to put more checks on president's power. But that's another measurement. But anyway, so let me show you the results. So, well, a little bit about data collection. I did 2 survey experiments, basically right before and after the election. So, in order to tap into this shock, so election in itself was a shock because no one can kind of predict well who was going to win, even though there are, of course, different people have different assessments. But basically, people didn't know that, obviously, before the election. So I tapped into that and therefore can use the difference and differences framework to do that. So one thing I would like to say here is that, okay, so the estimation framework is DID. And then also the control group, of course, these are people who didn't suffer from the electoral defeat. In other words, they are DPP supporters, and therefore, in a sense, there will be some continuity, at least during the election, or right after the election. But the losers, they are the people who suffer from the defeat, and therefore they are the treatment group. So, okay, quickly. So, as the results show, obviously, the people who suffer from the electoral defeat, they have much shorter time horizon. They believe the Taiwanese economy is doomed because Lai Ching-te won. They also think China is going to attack Taiwan much sooner. So that's you see that shorter time horizon, at least from the data. And also, I guess what is more interesting is that it doesn't just affect their time horizon, but also affect their policy preferences, because we have the measurements right before and after, so you can see the difference, right? So it's like, of course, it's a very short panel, so it's a very simple DID. Okay, so you can see it here. So for the baseline, just asking people, your willingness to fight. Then obviously you can, okay, so and then another thing to explain here is the lower and upper bound. It's a technical distinction because we have non-responses, right? So for the lower bounds, I exclude those non-responses, but for the upper bound, I include that. So in other words, but the thing is the results are pretty robust. So either you use the lower or upper bounds, the results are the same. So basically these people, the treatments, the electoral defeat, also make people less willing to fight. And also with the support from the US. So I used 2 different instruments. One is the recent military budget support for Taiwan from the US Congress. And another one is the Taiwan's Travel Act. So 2 things are obviously the support from the US. And I asked the question if they would be more willing to fight when they saw this kind of support. So you can see it here, NDAA, which is a specific bill about the military budget, and that one has a very obvious effect. So those who have shortened horizon, they are also less willing to fight. And what is a little bit disappointing is that, of course, the people who suffer from electoral defeat, they are also more willing to, or they are thinking about immigration. So they're thinking about moving out of the country after that. So they're thinking about the exit option. So in other words, electoral defeat make these people have shortened horizon, less willing to fight, and also want to leave the country as soon as possible. And also for the conscription, I didn't find the results. So basically, probably because conscription was something Tsai Ing-wen has done before, and therefore people didn't respond to that on either side, losers or winners. But for the cybersecurity, I mean, there was, of course, a widely believed accusation here that China obviously tried to meddle Taiwan's election through misinformation. So for that, you can also see that the electoral defeat also make people even actually less willing to believe in that. So that's another thing. So quickly, given those messages, and of course, if you have any questions about the models and also robustness, I can talk later. So for the conclusions, I think based on the survey data collected before and after Taiwan's 2024 presidential election, so the study adopts the DID estimation framework and offers a causal evidence for how electoral defeat as a crisis can shorten people's time horizon and also induce a higher level of policy polarization in a society. So in this case, as I just summarized, people become less willing to fight, and so that's a policy. So kind of obviously drove a wedge between these two groups of people, the winners and losers. Okay, so what's the implication? The implication here is that, with a weaker mandate, this suggests that, President Lai's strategic clarity will also face more polarized responses from the society, despite the fact that, this whole of society approach to national security needs obviously more social cooperation than ever. So, yeah, again, I'm not going to, at least for now, comment on that too much. But the thing is just that, we know the fact here, right? So we understand that there's a threat. And the solution offered by the current administration is to have much more social resilience, stronger social resilience, and also much more participation on top of just the military engagement, right? So you need more ordinary citizens to engage in such a social resilience endeavor. But the thing is, the approach also seems to be pretty, polarizing, and therefore it seems that the goal and the means and ends, they don't quite go aligned, and they don't quite go together. So I leave this as a question, and of course I don't have a very good answer now, even though of course things will evolve, I suppose, over time. So there must be a more effective way to reach across the aisle, and this is yet to be found. So I guess my message here is to give you a summary of the evolution of strategic ambiguity as a policy here in Taiwan over through different administrations. And second, given the data I just collected and also the analysis I did using the two survey experiments, we think that the election itself has driven, as I said, a wedge between two different groups, and Taiwanese society, in a sense, has become much more polarized than before. But at the same time, we now need a national defense or civil defense strategy that needs a cooperation from all sectors of the society, and how to accomplish that. So that would be the kind of challenge. And as I said, I would try harder, just as Danny, to find solutions to this. Thank you very much.
So I will be the first discussant, and I have some slides. To share with you. Because I was sitting right in the middle of that very long table, it would be very awkward for me to look back all the time at my slides. So I moved to this place. I think we've just listened to 4 wonderful papers. What I'm trying to do is to put all these papers in a framework, showing that the 4 papers are actually on 3 layers, on 3 levels of analysis. and they touch on various aspects of the current increasing tension between the United States and the PRC. And then I would like to suggest some of my own thoughts by harking back on the history of the Cold War. So I'm going to do these two things. I think we have three levels of analysis. The first level is the international system level, on which we have the wonderful paper presented by Professor Tang that talks about the odyssey of globalization. And in that paper, through a historical point of view, he looks at the rising globalization, first under the British hegemony in the 19th century, and then that was halted during the interwar period between World War I and World War II. But then after the end of World War II, under the American hegemony, globalization rose again, all the way until multiple crises happened, such as the pandemic, COVID-19, and especially the rising tension between the United States and the PRC. So he used a lot of graphs and the numbers to demonstrate the odyssey of globalization. And so the US-China rivalry is obviously a major reason for its disruption, the disruption of globalization in recent time. So this gives us an overall picture about why in the past we've been talking about globalization all the time, and nowadays we are talking about the geopolitics. So that's the first level of analysis. And actually the two papers assigned to me for discussion would be concentrate on the second level, the level of, okay, we have this overall international competition between the two great powers. How should the third nations, the middle powers, or the medium and small countries navigate between the great powers? And here we have two wonderful papers. The first one presented by Professor Guo. And in this paper, which is more conceptual and theoretical than empirical, he talks about the third nation strategies for navigating great power rivalry. I think it's wonderful that he points out that actually you don't always have the geopolitical competition and the economic globalization fully in line with fragmentation and coalescence. Namely, it's not that the political game would always push you towards a fragmented system and competition, and the economic system, economic cooperation would always lead you to a more coalesced, more cooperative world. It's not that simple. He emphasizes the importance of agency, of the initiatives, of the tactics and policies of those in the middle, namely the third nations. And those countries can make difference by adopting what he would suggest as one, inadvertent cooperation, second, nudging the great powers out of gridlock, and third, pathfinder multilateralism. Three approaches that those countries in between can take that may have an impact on the possibility of two ocean liners clashing. And so it's very innovative, and I think it's very energetic, and I think it points to the way that we may think in order to avert something that is too terrible for us to accept, namely we are sleepwalking into Cold War 2.0. By the way, that's exactly what I'm going to say for my own thoughts. But anyway, I think this is what we should think, whether we can avoid the terrible reappearance of the Cold War 2.0. So my question for that is, I know in the last 5 minutes, Professor Kua talks a little bit about the concrete policies that may be taken in order to avert the very pessimistic Thucydides trap. And my question is, can you be a little bit more specific in talking about the actual policies and movements adopted by countries like Singapore or other those that are caught in the middle that have already had some effect, even very little effect, but make things better? Because I think all these conceptual innovation is wonderful, and the idea of seeking a peaceful world is great, but then we really need to have concrete policies that can work. So I'm wondering whether you can give us a more concrete case, a policy by some middle countries that have already created some impact in ameliorating the rivalry between the two great powers. The third paper is presented by Professor Lee, and she offers very rich empirical case of Korea as navigating between the economic dependence on China and the security dependence on the United States. Now, this is the dilemma that all the countries caught in the middle, especially in Asia, faces. They have very deep economic ties with mainland China. On the other hand, they are security allies of the United States. Now, the two big countries are having great tensions between them. So how should those that are caught in the middle respond to this very difficult situation? And I think it's wonderful because it provides a detailed discussion of Korea's situation, how Korea responds to the rapidly changing international environment. Now, I have one question, because in the paper you mentioned, and approvingly I think, that the current Korean government remains focused on long-term economic independence from China, while upholding its security alliance with the United States. That seems to be something that you agree that Korea should take, this kind of policy. It's mentioned that South Korea has sought to mitigate risk by diversifying supply chains and investing in technological innovation to reduce reliance on China. And this strategy is essential not only for maintaining economic stability, but also for safeguarding Korean border security interests within the US-led security framework. So that's the impression that I got. But then, towards the end of your presentation, you also mentioned hybrid multilateralism. Hybrid multilateralism means that Korea should extend beyond traditional value-based alliances to include engagement with swing states, middle-grounded states, and countries with differing values and government structures. So that gives me the impression that Korea should maintain good relations with countries like the PRC. So what is your suggestion? Do you think these two policy orientations are compatible? Because this is the very difficult situation that many of the middle countries find themselves in. So I would like to seek your opinion on that. Okay, so these two are wonderful papers on the second level of analysis, which is the third nation finding itself in the difficult situation of great power competition between the United States and the PRC. The third level of analysis is offered by Professor Tung and his discussion of Taiwan domestic politics. And it is mentioned in his paper that domestic politics of a polarized frontline country and how it may impact on the country's position in great power rivalry. I think it's very interesting, especially for our guests from other countries, to get the taste of Taiwan politics through his paper. And I fully agree with him about his characterization of the three presidents' different policies towards mainland China and on unification and independence, which is the major dividing issue in Taiwan. And so this is the level of domestic politics of the middle countries. The first level is the systemic level. The second level is the how the middle countries may hope to cope with the difficult situation. The third one talks about the underlying domestic political competition between different parties, different opinions as to how to deal with the outside world. So these three layers, I think, are very inclusive in offering insights into the different aspects of the tension between the United States and the PRC and how the middle countries are dealing with it. So I think all these papers are wonderful. I've learned a lot from them. And I have made a little bit comments on the two second level papers, and my able colleague, Professor Tibogin, is going to discuss Professor Tang's paper and Professor Tung's paper. Okay, so a little bit about my own thought. And first, a caveat. What I'm talking about is what I'm afraid that the world is sleepwalking into. If we don't have any policies that can avert the trend. What I'm suggesting is we may move into a world Cold War 2.0. So we need to hark back to history and to find insights from what we have already experienced. So let's take a look at this. This is the time line. And from 1914 to 1918, we have World War I, right? And then from 1939 to 1945, we have World War II. And between the two great world wars, we had the interwar period between 1918 and 1939, roughly 2 decades. And then in 1947, the Cold War began. In 1991, the Cold War ended. And so we had the Cold War period from 1947 to 1991. At the time when the Cold War ended, we were thinking that, gosh, finally we are getting rid of this. We are no longer having to be worried about of mutual assured destruction. We are moving into the grave period of globalization. And like Francis Fukuyama has said, the end of history. Because liberal democracy and capitalism are the perfect human institutions that we would never be moving away from. And so this is the end of history. So we are in the post-Cold War period from 1991 onward to infinity. But then, lo and behold, in 2018, and I use American Vice President Pence address at the Hudson Institution as the beginning of the Cold War 2.0. And the reason for that is because Trump has never been very theoretical. But Pence's characterization of the international situation at the time, and his treatment of it, I think, is very is a defining moment of the beginning of Cold War 2.0. So if that's the case, then we have already moved into that Cold War. I don't want that to happen. I know there's great reluctance by many of us, including in this room, that would not want to accept that we have moved into Cold War 2.0. But I think we have all indications of actually we have already moved into that Cold War. So, what we had in the past, like 30 years, was not a post-Cold War period. It was an inter-Cold War period from 1991 to 2018. It's really very awkward because I remember when I grew up and went to the United States for my PhD degree, during that period of time, I was living under mutually assured destruction. And then, lo and behold, everything changed. It's globalization, it's all kinds of exchanges, it's very, very, very remote possibility of war, it's cross-strait détente and dialogue, and so on and so forth. And now I'm moving back into my young age, which is actually very unpleasant. So we had the very short blue bar and red bar suggesting the two great wars. And then the yellow bar showing the interwar period. And then we had this very strong protracted period of Cold War, also the blue bar. And then the red bar indicating where we are, and in the past 30 years, we were actually in that yellow period of the inter-Cold War period. That was like a nice dream. So what can we learn if we are realistically moving into a Cold War? What can we learn from the experience and history of Cold War 1.0? Well, I think the most important structural feature of Cold War 1.0 is bipolarization. So, like then, what we are having is the forming of two opposing camps, a maritime alliance led by the United States versus great continental powers, today China and Russia, and in Cold War 1.0, the Soviet Union and China. Both are hierarchical. I mean, the maritime alliance and the Continental Alliance. We know who's the boss. Middle position and the non-alignment position become difficult for medium and small countries. Even so, domestic politics in frontline countries plays a role in determining their positions in global hegemonic rivalry. So now, as then, if you want to play a middle role, it will be very difficult because the two great camps would exert heavy influence on domestic politics of these medium and small countries. Now, obviously, you can choose to be an ally of one of the two camps. But then, like Taiwan, even that is difficult, right? Because Taiwan is not recognized as a state by the United States. It does not enjoy the defense commitment by the United States or the Maritime Alliance, even though many of us want us to be in that position. And so it's very difficult. It's a bipolar world, and so middle ground is difficult. Now, what we have right now, as we had at that time, is there will be increasing solidarity within the bloc willy-nilly. If you want it, you don't want it, you will be forced into that position. For example, the Republic of Korea and Japan cooperate with each other at the urge of the United States. I've never seen any Korean president that is as eager as the current president to embrace Japan. Because, you know, we all know the historical animosity and so on and so forth, the legacy. The two countries typically do not get along very well. But then under the urge of the United States, we are seeing increasing bloc solidarity. And that is a sign of bipolarization. Why has the United States been so insistent on South Korea and Japan improving their relations? Because they are the important allies in the US bloc that will face the threat of China. The bloc members, not only they would cooperate, they will be geared towards a designated enemy. So Russia and China for the Maritime Alliance. So you will cooperate, but cooperate on what? On facing a common enemy. So it's both cooperation, so it's both improving relations among nations and toughening your stance against other nations. These two come hand in hand because that's the typical feature of bipolarization. It's not just going on in the Maritime Alliance, it's also happening in the Continental Alliance. Look at the way Russia and, you know, countries like Iran and etc., North Korea, they are cooperating. And even though we have two camps, geographically, we have two geostrategic fault lines, one in Eastern Europe and one in East Asia. Now, we have just suggested that you will have in-group, in-block solidarity and inter-block animosity, right? But then because you have two geostrategic fault lines, so we are seeing is a very interesting phenomenon. Namely, those countries that are geographically in Europe will be brought to Asia to reinforce the maritime position in Asia. And that's why we are having the German warships, the British warships, the Canadian warships, and of course, Japanese warships, together with American warships, passing the Taiwan Strait. And that's why we are having Taiwan making friends with East European countries such as the Czech Republic, such as Lithuania, and so on and so forth. So countries that are geographically away from the other strategic fault line will be brought to this strategic fault line to reinforce the overall position of the camp. By the same token, the Australian, New Zealand leaders and the leaders of Korea and Japan will be brought to the NATO summit in Madrid to reinforce the camp's position in Europe. So European countries are brought to Asia, Asian countries are brought to Europe, because we are talking about a global, bipolarized confrontation between the Maritime Alliance and the Continental Alliance. So that's what we are moving into. Even vaccines, we are seeing vaccines playing the same role during the pandemic. So even though, and this is we harking back on history again, even though nuclear exchange between major power contenders is unlikely now as in the past, proxy wars are common instruments of their competition. This may lead to peace in the core area where you have nuclear umbrella covering the security of the major countries that the hegemon would like to protect. But then wars in the periphery, and this is the situation that is going on in Ukraine. And when people in Taiwan look at Ukraine, they are saying, goodness, is this a rehearsal of what is going to happen to us? And this is harking back on, to history. The Cold War will not end until at least one side is exhausted. How can you imagine the United States and the PRC lowering their tension without one side is exhausted? Finally, what I would like to say is this is the very dismal picture that I would like to paint for you in order to motivate you and all of us to think in Professor Kua's terms, because otherwise we may really walk sleep into this situation. So thank you very much.
All right, so I have the tough job here to finish this here. Okay, here. The wrap up here, and to have papers, as you understood, at level 1 and level 3, but also hopefully have a few things to bring things together and a bit more optimism. So I'll start by thanking our chair, Professor Wu Yushan. I want to thank Chairman Huang, Dean Chen, Dean Huang, and Hans for having me here. It's very, very exciting. I think in all those papers and the remarks by our chair, there are a few other common points that have not been mentioned. So we all understand that there is a lot of talk about disruption, crisis, both at the global level, the crisis of globalization, and at the great power level, US, China. And so at the first level, actually, there is quite a diversity of assessment of the situation. There is so many changes going on at the same time, and in an interactive manner. So we're dealing with interacting disruptions, which is very hard to model, right? And so what we don't know is the degree of resilience of the systems, the global systems upon which we depend in the midst of so many interacting disruptions. I notice in this respect that the term hegemony came out twice, once negatively, once positively in the speakers, because there was the mention of Thucydides traps and Allison and the bad stuff here, but also Kinderberger. And Kinderberger is, in a way, is also coming out of realism and hegemonic, the importance of hegemony. And in fact, hegemonic transition in this case doesn't lead to war, but leads to great crisis. So we know we have to deal with that. And in all the papers, we're dealing with the multiple adjustment strategies at multiple levels by especially third nations, because that's the topic, as we heard at the beginning. And so we are evaluating the resilience, but also the impact on democracy in the case of Taiwan, or the impact on the global system. The big question that's, I think, lurking behind all this is, can the global order and the global economy survive this current phase of disruption and great power competition? And there is a big struggle between disruption on one hand and stabilizers, sources of resilience. We have a battle also between decay and innovation that's arising from those papers. So that's a few framing terms. For the students in the class, I think we get here to the core of the IP class that all of you have been taking. It's the balance between markets and governance, markets and rules, and all this is up for grabs right now. So I'll give basically one question to the first two papers each, and then more questions for the next papers. So for Professor Xinhua Li, old friend, many years, it's wonderful to see you here. It's actually fascinating to learn from Korea's adjustment strategies, basically. Korea is a frontline state right in the heart of this cauldron, and is actually, because of the history that it has had of dealing with so many shocks, it's hyper-reactive. It's like a canary in a coal mine, and so everybody can learn from Korea. And I think the question arising from the 7 strategies you described Korea taking in the face of all the disruptions, I guess it's a mix of deterrence and complex deterrence, and also opportunism, trying to make sure Korea gains from that, right, in a way. And deterrence brings us back to shelling, and in the end, there's a trilogy for shelling, and that's super relevant for Taiwan. It's about capabilities, willingness or credibility, and communication or reassurance. So there was this important part on the shelling. And I think, so it's fascinating, I want to push you more on this. What's the lesson from Korea on making deterrence work? And is Korea actually investing willingly in all 3 pillars of Schelling's model of deterrence? And I'm guessing the revival of the trilateral, the CJK trilateral, is part of that third part, the communication or reassurance. For Professor Danny Quah, there is fascinating battle here between the trade interconnectedness as a stabilizer in the world versus global fragmentation. So there's, again, that great battle going on. And Danny shows how the balance has worked for 50 years and how trade, in a way, in a centripetal way, reinforced cooperation. But then the last 2 decades have seen changing conditions, all those disruptions. And then he gets to the 3 potential solutions, which are very creative. So the question I had for Danny is, in the end, beyond just the process of nudging, of preventing conflict, do we need, I want to hear you on the end goal. Do we need an end goal to get the balance between global markets and institutions working better? Because if we believe Danny Roderick, that balance has gone off kilter, what's called hyper-globalization, or global markets, global integration going ahead of Williamson-style institutions that keep the markets functioning with enough trust and enough resilience. And so is the goal partly to do what Danny Roderick calls for, which is adjusting globalization downward in a smooth way, which is very hard to negotiate. But can the methods you're showing help us do that in order to reduce the tensions? Because you described the tensions happening from global markets. There are 2 types. Number one is there have been too fast, in a way, relative gains for one player, China, relative to the other. So the hegemon wants to then shut down the game. But also there is too much impact on society and too much polarization, both in a way due to the lack of governance of the process. In a way, the process gets ahead of what Schumpeter would say are the institutions that are required to sustain it. So how can we get this balance back, and can the three processes and the third parties that you described play a role in this? Do they have a strategy beyond preventing the two tankers hitting each other? So now I turn to Professor Haewon Tong, and there was a lot in the paper, but there's a lot more here. So that was pretty fascinating, the amount of data and thinking that Professor Tong has gone through. So the focus is on globalization, but also the shocks and disruptions, followed by adaptations. Well, to be efficient, I'm going to skip directly more to the questions. I noticed that the presentation was a little more emphasizing risks and a little more pessimistic than the paper, which I found quite neutral. The paper had both disruptions and adjustment strategies, and it left the reader open to what might happen. Whereas the presentation may have been a little more showing that the risks, there's a lot more going on here in a lot of disruptions. So I'm curious, in the end, so my first question is on the evaluation of all the forces happening now, the competition between great power, disruption, competition, and all the adjustment strategies, including the role of third parties, like Vietnam, like all those intermediaries. Do you see today in the game more resilience or more disruption? Are we, if we have your core evaluation, are we still holding relatively stable? You said globalization is not going away, thanks to all those middle players in a way. Or on balance, are we still hedging downward, or are those coping strategies temporary and not sustainable? And going with it, the global South middle powers, the hedgers, as well as multinational corporations, are they providing lasting resilience and anti-fragile characteristics in the system, or are they not sufficient, right, in the end? Are they just a temporary stopgap? We heard from Tony Sage that the tech war and the AI competition is another level. How will all those systems relying on third parties hold, during this increased technologization? And then the deep question behind the global economy, ever since we have one, going back 200 years, is whether a decentralized equilibrium can hold the global economy together, or whether the global economy facing all kind of uncertainty, differential gains and losses, public good problems, public bad problems, market failures and crises, in the end still requires global institutions that must be robust. And if so, then what is the source today of the innovation? And is that innovation of a critical mass enough? Is it at the right level? Do we need, and how far can the mismatch between global markets and supply chain on the one hand and global governance go before being stretched too far? So I'm curious to hear you about those thoughts. What's interesting is the model, all the adjustment strategies that you described, but also what Danico has described, is actually quite decentralized. There's a lot of middle players that are doing a lot of things. But it's very different from Bretton Woods, 1944. The summer 1944, 2 months in New Hampshire, there was really strategic thinking going on. And it was a conscious choice to restart trade, but to slow finance, and to slow capital flows and the like, and to find an interesting fine-tuned balance. So there was a very strong presence of institutions relative to markets. And that held the economy for a long time. Can we now do without such things in a much more decentralized way? And now I turn to Professor Tong. Again, the presentation had a lot more than the paper. That was fascinating. I think your very sharp analysis of the strategic ambiguity evolution over those. Be interesting to have the Chen Shui-bian in that table, by the way, Chen Shui-bian government, to see if we, how you would characterize it. Was there any strategic ambiguity then, or in a sense, is Lai going back to some of that? But the paper itself is very creative and very high-tech. looking at endogeniizing the time horizon. And the findings are pretty interesting. One being that the crisis facilitates or accelerates polarization, and the election being the crisis. So that's super relevant for the US, by the way. We can expect accrued polarization in November rather than less, right? We also find that the loser end up having a shorter time horizon than the winner, which is also interesting. And then preferred approaches to cross-strait relations get more polarized and evolve after the election as a result of the election. So all this is very, very interesting. But that leads me to a few questions. The first one is actually in the paper itself, there's a lot of data and a lot of different findings. A lot of, and so I was curious, if we pushed you even more, in the end, what is the one top finding that you find the most surprising? What surprised you the most in this research? It's actually interesting. For me, one finding that was quite interesting is the evolution of Kuomintang voters, who, technically the Kuomintang was saying, the threat from China is not as great as the DPP is saying. Therefore, we should, you should be reassured the threat is more DPP that can create trouble. But then post-hoc, the Kuomintang voters, who after losing, are more likely to want to leave and to feel that there's more threat, that the threat from China is real. So it seems that the perception of threat of China by the losers, by the Kuomintang voters, has evolved, and I find this quite surprising. For the impact of crisis of polarization, one thing that came to my mind is Kahneman. So bringing it back to psychology, he discussed some of the psychology literature, but Kahneman's System 1, System 2 frame, in some of his books, he has argued that when there's a crisis, when there's a disruption, it shortens the time horizon, but also it increases our reliance on System 1. Therefore, more intuitive, more emotional, less thoughtful, less analytical. And I wonder if that's happening here as well, if that's relevant. I did have a bit of puzzle reading your hypothesis 1 on knowing, how do we know ex ante who the losers will be? Because there is already a language of losers. Hypothesis 1, right? But how do we know the difference between ex ante and ex post? And how can losers know that they would lose ex ante? And that's therefore their strategy or their identity change. I had also a bit of question on this winner-take-all system that you described, because in the end, Taiwan has 2 votes. There's the presidential and the parliament. And so there would be a counter-interpretation where we could say that voters in January were very strategic. They gave the presidency to DPP because they wanted to keep the status quo of the policy that was pursued, and they didn't want to go back to Kuomintang. But on the other hand, they didn't trust them enough to give the majority in parliament. And so there was a strategic hedging or very strategic choice made by voters. And that was democratic, right, in that sense. So I wonder if then we can qualify this winner-take-all as not being winner-take-all in the end. The system allows for that. And then finally, as an outsider, I was there during the election, I've been struck by the very changing story of democracy in Taiwan during 2024. In January, it was all about this extraordinary, well-run election, say by comparison to the US one. You could go in a voting booth, or you can go to see the vote counting. It was all public, transparent. Within 3 hours, we knew the winners. Everything was accepted by all sides. Extremely well-run. And then within a couple months, we moved to gridlock in parliament. And one side saying that whatever parliament does is undemocratic. Parliament also pushing the boundaries beyond what we could call institutional forbearance, if I quote Levinsky at Ziblatt. And then we moved to the arrest of the leader of the third party, which in any democracy is very risky, because that means if you lose, it's really existential. You end up in jail, right? And so actually, speaking on the existential view of electoral defeat that you mentioned, I wondered whether the TPP, especially Ko Wen-je, realized how existential it was. Because in the end, he did not do the agreement with Kuomintang before the election. But had he known the risk of arrest, would he then have done the risk? Or did they have a full awareness of how existential it was? Anyway, I'm leading this. Now, just to conclude, so we are in a period of great risk and disruptions. All papers agree on this. We do see a new dynamic of Cold War II, and that's structural because it's the fight for the power that can organize the institutions that are supporting the global economy. We also see security dynamics trumping economic logic, and so we heard this especially from our chair. But to add another perspective, we also see at the same time a more diverse world. We see a rising global south that calls itself now global majority, not global south, similar to the 80% of Danny Quah. Eikenberry talks of a triple world. He talks of the West, the East, and the South as being very different. So he sees this as a non-bipolar at all. Of course, Amitav Acharya talks of a multiplex world, very diverse, very flexible. And so in a world like this, there are ways to address the rising tensions and the risk to the global economy and maybe stabilize the order. And that's where Danny Quah's paper was going. There are multiple sources of agency, some agency from middle players and third states, but other agencies from non-state actors as well. And places like the G20, which is very flexible. It's a very multi-nodal, multi-layered system. And it probably why we panic or why we see this in a very dramatic way, it could be also a simple lack of imagination. The research from psychology and neuroscience shows that in times of crisis, when things are fast, we go back to old frames and old examples of history. But when we actually have capacities as humans to innovate and imagine very different things, there is capacity for more imagination, to in a way stop the speed a little bit and say, wait a minute, there's so many ways to deal with this. And so I hope, and I'm looking at all the students in the back here, this is your job in all the papers, that out of this conference, we can stimulate a lot of very creative research in new ways to cope with those disruptions, to maintain a degree of order that is peace, security, and an economy that works, accepting decays of some institutions, but also playing a role in the innovation that's required from multiple aspects to sustain some other pillars. So thank you very much.
So should we welcome back all the panelists, or?
Yeah, they should. There's no time.
OK， 所以现在就要结束了。OK， 好。For the interest of time, because we are going to have a lunch keynote speech, so we have to stop the session here without Q&A. I'm really sorry for not being able to be effective. Okay, so the compromise is giving a mission impossible. Please respond in 3 minutes to the discussants' comments. First, Professor Lee.
You should look at the audience. No, the audience should look at you.
Well, thank you. Well, basically, the question is about how Korea can juggle between the strategic ambiguity and strategic clarity, speaking of the security and economic issues. So how to strike the balance between those things, what we call Anmi Gyeongjung, is always a big task for South Korean strategists. For that, basically, at least for the current Yoon administration, is already having a very clearly expressed about their strategic clarity, tilting toward the U.S. much more than the China, particularly because those greater alliance with the U.S. reflect the changing global complexity and the global uncertainty. For that, I think that is basically strategic survivor strategy for us rather than kind of the option. But at the same time, the President Yoon tried hard to talk about that we have to give more either pressure or calling for China to do some more roles when it comes to North Korea's denuclearization issues. So whenever he got a chance, he's talking about the role of China. When I talk about the hybrid multilateralism, I'm not talking about engaging with Russia or China. I'm talking about while South Korea is consolidating our like-minded countries' cooperation and solidarity on one hand, based on that as a strong platform, I think we have to more engage with or persuade the unlike-minded countries. That doesn't necessarily, they don't share the idea with what the US-led, the like-minded countries collaboration, but at the same time, they believe in universal value like global norm, rule of law, or human rights. So when I was working for ambassador for North Korean human rights issues, many of those unlike-minded countries, the countries or swing states, voting against North Korea's human rights abuses. So I think that indicate one of the like a sign for we can extend our collaborations with what I call unlike-minded or swing states. That's what I was talking. Briefly for the deterrence issues, together with Korea, China, U.S. Camp David summit, we have to institutionalizing that trilateral cooperation so that they can not go beyond the leadership change. But at the same time, we try to having an independent military build-up, so-called extended nuclear deterrence by the U.S. At the same time, we've been very closely discussing about the possibility of our own, like nuclear build-up or at least some kind of things for the preliminary stage for the nuclear issue. But of course, that just brought about a lot of the domestic split and the domestic confrontations. No matter what, how we can overcome like a progressive and conservative the political debate in Korea is very important to making our grand strategies.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you both for such a wonderful discussion of all of our ideas and for your being so kind and generous to all of us, but to me in particular. I really appreciated your kind and generous comments. Professor Wu, on your question or your urging to me that this framework is valuable and generous, but it needs to have more of the specific concrete details put in. Examples need to be put together of real-world instances where inadvertent cooperation, nudging out of gridlock, and plurilateralism or Pathfinder multilateralism can work. I take that as a project. I take that as a research and a writing and maybe even a book project to try and put all these things together. And I am in the process of doing all of these things. So thank you very much for your urging. Is on your discussion about, on your very kind bringing in of a connection between what I talked about in terms of the economics and the geopolitics and Danny Roderick's. I spent a lot of time talking to Danny Roderick about these issues as well, and we do see a connection. I think that, my point here is that for so long we have thought about economics as being one domain, geopolitics as another domain, geopolitics and security as another domain. We've talked about how Southeast Asia looks to China for its economics and looks to America for its security. And one of the things that I've tried to do in my analysis is to suggest that actually the division shouldn't be that sharp. These things work together, and they work together in unexpected ways. My point about, and let me finish with this, my point about globalization and trade and how it relates to Danny Roderick's hyper-globalization discussion is that I think my point is much simpler. I believe in what economists say about how trade really is win-win, but it's win-win at the aggregate for nations, for people. People's lived experiences of globalization is not the same as the national experience of globalization. Globalization and trade work because when they occur, they disrupt and change relative prices. If they didn't do that, they wouldn't be effective. But when relative prices change, someone, somewhere in the economy is going to be disadvantaged by definition. And we have, for too long, used social science and economics to talk only about the win-win side at the national level, and we have not acknowledged how the individual lived experience is different. This is not the same as simply saying that trade brings inequality, because the lived experience can be disruptive, not just for people at the bottom of the income distribution, but for also people at the top. Every time you change relative prices, someone's going to be dissatisfied. So my point is much simpler than Danny Roderick's hyperglobalization. I want to suggest that we can build mechanisms along the way of these concrete examples where we can once again align people's lived experience with the comparative advantage narrative from David Ricardo. I have some ideas about how we do that, and I hope we can talk about that at some future event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Tang.
Well, thank you so much for the two discussions, wonderful comments and suggestions. It's not easy to spend only 15 minutes to discuss 4 very different papers, especially mine that has so many facts and numbers. Professor Tinbergen's questions are very deep and difficult to be answered in 3 minutes. But let me try to answer it by saying the following. I like Fred Bernstein's argument about functional decoupling, right? Fred Bernstein from Peterson Institute argued that there are certain areas over which the US and China would have extreme difficulty to collaborate on. For example, AI and anything related to semiconductors. So for those areas, we have to give up our optimism, right? There's no way, in my opinion, that these two countries are collaborate. But hopefully on something that is less political or technologically less sensitive, they can find common grounds to work with each other and help other countries to be on the same boat. Climate change is one of them, and also drug discovery is another one. I hope that from some functional collaboration, it will be a good start for more collaboration between the two big powers, and therefore the world will start going back from a sort of fragmented regionalism order to something that is closer to a multilateral order. But the last thing I want to say is, even though I'm a trade economist and I study a lot of work by Jyotish Bhagwati, I don't believe that regionalism is necessarily a bowl of spaghetti. I think that if the WTO find it so difficult to move on, it would be great to have more sort of inclusive regional trade agreement to have at least some countries that share some common goals to work with each other first, and when those regional trade agreements succeed, then they will get new members, and eventually we are heading back to a multilateral order. If you ask me when it would happen, probably in another 2 or 3 decades. But we're not giving up. On the one hand, we want WTO to move on and do whatever reforms they need to do. But at the same time, small countries along with big ones, need to work together on some common issues and form regional agreements. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Tong.
All right. Thank you again for all the comments, and I got some specific ones. So let me just try to answer them all of them. So first of all, it's about that the kind of identification of losers versus winners. Well, basically, of course, in a pre-shock survey, of course, we asked them who would you like to vote. Then you got, and then after that, we also ask who did you vote. And so there are different ways to specify that. And I think in the paper, I try to, of course, just as we do in all papers, just try robustness tests to, to see if all these different specifications will lead to same results. But the thing is, regarding that particular question you asked, well, of course, I mean, before the shock, there's no such identification because the election hasn't happened. So, but that's precisely the design, right? Because before the shock, no one knew the results. But the thing is, we can kind of trace their answers in a post-shock survey to identify their group identification. So that's how we distinguish between losers and winners. So that's kind of like a more technical question. So, and second question is another more substantive judgment on like Taiwanese political system. Like, you know, you mentioned that, well, Taiwan, of course, is not a presidential system, it's a semi-presidential system. And well, Professor Wu here is an expert on this. So in Taiwan system, I guess the point here is more about, well, that's at least my understanding, that in terms of the perceptions, either among elites or among people, Taiwanese president is very powerful, so, or the executive is very powerful. That's why, I mean, whether you agree with that or not, I mean, for example, the opposition leaders for a time, they were arguing we should make Taiwanese constitution change again and then make it more parliamentary than presidential. And of course, I guess the strategic thinking here is that because KMT, they thought they would win the Congress anyway. So if you can change the system back to the parliamentary system, then it will become the party in power. That's the thought. But anyway, but I guess the impression I got from then or other surveys is that the executive power in Taiwan, I think, is much stronger than, or at least in people's perceptions, is pretty strong. That's why, well, if you want to do the comparison systematically, of course, you might find maybe that's not the most powerful executive among other systems, but at least in terms of the survey, that's the kind of thing I'm trying to tap into. So that's the response for that. And the most surprising finding, of course, I mean, the reason why I included so many different policy measurements is that, well, in a sense, I think there is indeed such a sorting here in Taiwan. So, you know, the polarization, they're forced under several different conditions, and some of them actually go in tandem with each other. And therefore, those different policy measurements, actually, they're trying to measure, you know, how divided it is, how polarized it is in Taiwan. And, but if you want me to say which one is most surprising, I think it would be maybe the will to fight. Because you know what, there are lots of survey research recently about that, right? You know, but I don't know if you agree with me on that or not, but I never believe in that absolute number. For example, they would say, well, 75% of the Taiwanese young people would like to fight if there is such invasion, or 60% or whatever. So I think, of course, you know, we all know that there are social desirability biases here, and it's hard to get rid of that. But what I always instead believe in is that we can know the difference, right? So you can know the differences among different political groups, like blue and green, and like this winners and losers. I don't quite believe in that absolute levels, but I think what is interesting is the differences among them. So even despite the presence of the social desirability bias, we can still get that difference, right? So that's something I think, you know, the most surprising thing, that even an election result can actually, you know, make people more or less willing to do that. So that's maybe, and of course, this is also quite significant in terms of, in terms of sending signals, you know, to other partners, right? Because, well, now it's like a little bit like a chicken egg. Well, Taiwan would say, well, we need the support from other countries, but at the same time, other countries are looking at you and how, you know, determined you are in defending your own nation, right? And therefore, these two things, you know, they have to go hand in hand, and you know, and that's why I guess in the end, my question is, how can the current leader get across the aisle and to make, you know, Taiwan more unified, and you know, for certain goals, even though that goal is yet to be specified. So that would be the third response. I think that's that's probably most of the questions I get. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. This concludes this session.